always trying to have some kind of mental models around things because it helps give structure and some sense of sanity to things that you jump onto. Otherwise, it all can jump all over the place. So that anything has to be either useful or entertaining. If it's not useful and it's not entertaining, it's useless. If you want to read about man's failures, start from the first page of a newspaper. If you want to learn about his successes, start from the obituaries. Three traits that are the hallmarks of any great president are these three: curiosity, humility, and empathy. And it's very easy, and empathy has become a fashionable word. It's become fashionable to say I'm an empath or whatever that means. But I think it's important to have a very tangible way of approaching these as well, because it's
Okay.
not easy.
Okay, so today we have with us Lakshmanan, called Aka Lux Narayan. Okay, so he's a different kind of leaders in our list of interviews so far. And Lux is a student of storytelling. He loves the seas, skies, and mountains. So he's a scuba diver, pilot, and an avid hiker. His adult sons share his love for adventure. His wife and best friend Tina, also my classmate, and their dog, rescue from Hurricane Maria, partake in all their ground level adventures. So Lux gave a talk at TED's main stage on lessons from 2000 obituaries, and it was viewed millions of times. And he was featured on the TED homepage and NPR's TED Radio Hour with Guy Raz. He's a student of improv and stand-up comedy and has performed at the Comedy Cellar in New York. Also, Lux is a serial entrepreneur. He founded Unmetric, a social media analytics company that was acquired in 2019. He advises a few startups and nonprofits and is an independent board member at a public fintech company. And in 2021, he's co-founded Wordsworth.ai. So Lux has recently also published his first book, NPAT, Name, Place, Animal, Things. And it's an inspiring fable about hope, positivity, and living your best life, and a practical guide to answering the ultimate question: so, what do you do? And I read this book a few weeks back. I totally loved it and implemented some of the concepts right away. So, finally, I also had the privilege of knowing Lux from our college times at IIM Calcutta. Thank you, Lux, for joining us.
Pleasure, man. I'm glad we got around to doing this. Thanks for reaching out, and thanks for that introduction. I'm going to steal that recording afterwards and use it whenever I need to do an introduction. So thank you.
And so, as I shared with you, this show is focused basically on learning through stories, real life stories, especially of ups and downs. So, give me a bit about your life journey beyond whatever I shared.
Yeah, let me actually take the easy route out here. Let me go reverse chronological because that serves memory the best. So start from now and go back to, I think I've been waiting to use this line. Go back to when I knew Single when he was single. So go all the way up to there. Sorry, horrible pun. So right now, like you mentioned, on a new startup journey, which is this new company we just incorporated. It's called Wordsworth.ai. It's in the audience interaction space. So after thinking I may not get into the whole startup saddle again, that's kind of where I am back, because I think the siren lure of that was too hard to resist, I found. And I did a fair amount of introspection last year and found that if this is what I enjoy, why resist it? And that I'm all ready and pumped up for a new journey altogether. So that is the 2021 big thing, besides, of course, the book. And thanks for mentioning that. So that is one. It
Yes.
kind of launched earlier this month. So it's just about 2 weeks since it
Can we see
launched.
it
And
properly in front? Just show it.
sure, absolutely.
Ah,
There it is. Name, place,
yes.
animal, thing.
Yes.
I want to clarify, it's not a children's book. It's a modern fable for grown-ups, because a lot of people look at it and it cues memories of childhood, but then they think it's one of those kindergarten things saying N for name, P for place. And
Yeah. And it
so,
has
so
the
this has
primary
been,
colors.
it has a primary, of course, yeah, it
Some
does,
of
yeah.
them.
So this has been a big journey, because I've been working on this for the last few months, and to see it and actually hold it and be able to show it to you on our conversation today feels fantastic, because it was almost an impossible milestone a few months ago. So this has been lovely entrepreneurial journey onto itself.
Mm.
Prior to this, for the almost the last 10 years, I was running a company called Unmetric in the social media benchmarking space.
Mm.
Started the company in 2011. Actually, started a precursor to it in 2010
Mm.
in Chennai. It started from a spare bedroom in our house, and then it grew to 5, 10 people, and we obviously outgrew the bedroom, and then took an office in Chennai.
Mm.
Hired people here in the States, and just about when I found myself coming here a little too often, relocated here in 2013. And
Mm.
then I've been here stateside, but I've been doing the reverse, coming to India about 4 times a year till, of course, COVID hit, right?
Okay.
So I was running Unmetric till the end of 2019. And at that time, we got acquired.
Mm.
And maybe we'll talk more about the acquisition and how things changed further down. But just to give you a bird's eye view, that happened.
Mm.
And then for various personal reasons on the family front, I chose to leave a few months later, after our last person on the team had transitioned.
Mm.
So in somewhere in the middle of 2020 is when I left the company that I'd founded. And that's when I also got the bandwidth and time to write the book and pursue a whole bunch of other things, introspect a lot, and decide startups is where I want to get back again. So that kind of summarizes the last 10, 11 years. Prior to that, I was a co-founder at a company called Wembu Technologies in
Mm.
the tech data backup space.
Mm.
The founder of the company, Shekhar Wembu, is one of my best friends from college, and he's best known for being a co-founder of this company called
So,
Zoho,
mm. Mm.
which everyone knows. So his brother Sridhar Wembu, Kumar Wembu, and others founded Zoho. So Shekhar introduced me to the whole beauty of the ability to build a tech company out of India for literally anyone in the world, right? That right now is something we take for granted, but in 2005 and around that time, it wasn't as obvious as it is right now. India was known more for services companies. Shekhar convinced me to leave my advertising job, which was in Dubai with Lintas and Initiative Media before that. So 2005, I left Dubai to move to Chennai to join him there.
Mm.
And 2008 to 2005, sorry, 98 to 2005 was advertising in Dubai.
Mm.
Which is we moved there just after our first son was born, and our second son was born over there. So Tina, me, and our boys lived there for some time before we relocated to Chennai.
Mm.
98, I'd left Bombay from being an entrepreneur for a couple of years. Basically, anything that would make money in direct marketing and reselling the rights of Hindi movies to various territories.
Oh,
And before that, a year at the erstwhile Amitabh Bachchan Corporation Limited, which was my
okay.
first job out of college, ABCL.
Acha. You
Colorful
were with
company.
Harish Chawla.
I was there before Harish joined, in fact. So
Acha.
yes, but Harish and I overlapped for some time. Yeah.
Mm.
So fun times, and I'm sure as you might have heard from him as well. Very 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 colorful stories from those days over there.
Yeah.
It is a crazy and fantastic first job to get onto from campus, which kind of brings me to when we met, which was in IIM Calcutta, which
Mm.
was 93 to 95.
Mm.
We overlapped for a year over there. And I think
Yeah.
the most constructive thing I did over there was meet Tina, who I'm married to. So
Mm.
college worked out pretty well, at least B school worked out pretty well.
Mm.
And prior to that, I was at IIT Madras from 89 to 93, where again, I think the most constructive thing I did was meet my co-founders at Wembu and at Unmetric.
Oh.
One of whom is going to be my co-founder in the new adventure with Wordsworth as well.
Mm. Mm.
So
Mm.
Tina, me, and this friend Jose, we are all going to be co-founders in this new company.
Okay.
And before that was schooling. A large part of it was in Dubai,
Oh, okay.
and so that's a different story and adventure onto itself. And prior to that, I was born and brought up in Bombay. So lived in Bombay for some time before my dad relocated to Dubai, like any good South Indian Mallu person would at that point, I guess. You're not full
Oh.
Mallu, but yeah.
Mm. Very interesting way of count down. And okay, so let me keep you with your childhood. What would you say was your biggest childhood challenge?
There are many, I think, man. And I think one would have been, and I think this is something every kid goes through, and it's so pronounced at that point, and then afterwards it feels almost silly looking back in the mirror and talking about it, right? So there were a couple of things that are salient and stay top of mind. One was this morbid fear of talking to girls.
Okay, welcome to the club.
Okay. I could see I could see your eyes light up with meat with a kind of okay, I've been there, done that kinds. But besides it being maybe intrinsic in some ways, and people who know me today might be surprised to hear that, because that's far from the case today. I'm very comfortable with people in general. But at that point, I think it was also shaped by the environment, because, like I told you, I grew up in Dubai. And at that point, the singular focus when I was growing up as a kid was, you got to crack your entrance exams. At that point, actually, no, I'm wrong. It was you got to crack your 12th standard, because there was an NRI quota for getting into IIT.
Okay.
Which was scrapped exactly a year and a half or 2 years before I wrote the JEE, before I was supposed to go in. And suddenly this whole NRI quota I was preparing for disappeared. So I suddenly had 2 years to prepare for the JEE. So ACADS was the cornerstone for my life at that point. First it was crack school, then it was, okay, forget school, you need to crack this exam called the JEE. So the moment school closes, get shipped to Chennai, sit there, go for all these coaching classes, mug your heart out, and then, that was the ultimate goal. And obviously that didn't leave much time for socialization, girls and all that. And the environment also compounded that. I was in this school called the Indian High School, which was co-ed with a difference. The boys go in the afternoon, the girls go in the morning. So you have two shifts.
Okay.
So girls is from, if I recall right, from about 8 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and boys is from 1 o'clock to 5:30. And obviously there's this overlap period of 15 minutes when the boys are entering the building and the girls are leaving the building. I'm not exaggerating, Rohan. There would be these glass doors, okay, and the girls would vacate the classrooms and walk past the doors, and all the boys would be almost literally salivating, standing behind those doors. And when the last girl walks down the staircase,
and the door is
the
open.
monitor, which is a coveted position because a monitor stood on the other side of the glass door, would open the glass door, and the boys would walk into the classrooms that the girls had just vacated. Right. Love notes, none of which I got, were scribbled on, with compasses on wooden desks, where that was, I think, the original Twitter, Facebook, and all. People would post messages on the table. Girls would leave it in the morning for the boys would leave it in the night for the girls. I had none of that. So I think that contributed in a way, because we had 15 minutes of seeing girls before they vacated the building. And then I guess this as well. Coming into IIT didn't improve the situation, because the male to female ratio, those days at least, was pretty sad. So I could be forgiven for thinking that the human species had only one gender for those years. So I think that was a big part of things. The other thing that rings from childhood as a challenge was, I was in a class of 30. I think I was the second shortest.
Oh, is that so?
And as pretty, plump and podgy and chubby, as people would say, well-rounded personality, let's say. For some reason at that point that made a difference, and that was, I guess, it's teenage angst and stuff, but those were things that played in my head a lot. Again, now when you look back, you feel slightly silly even recounting it, but it was true at that point, man.
Okay, so what would you call as some of the 2-3 proud moments or key milestones of your life?
I think I've been fortunate to have more than a couple. So again, I'm going to take the easy route out and go chronologically. So getting into IIT was a big milestone, because of imagining that it was impossible, and I think that was big. I transformed as a person over there, because suddenly my priorities in life moved from excelling in academics into trying to get into the institute football team. That was my number one priority.
Okay.
IMC was a big milestone as well. Again, for the fact that I met some amazing people, made some amazing friends, and met my future wife over there. I think those would be key milestones. Obviously, like everybody, the birth of our kids was a big milestone. I made big life decisions and changes around that time. And then 2005, getting into this whole tech ecosystem was a milestone, because that defined what I would do for the next 15, 16, and what I'm currently doing as well.
Okay.
So a lot of milestones. And when you look in a rear view mirror, everything seems to make perfect sense. But of course, it didn't make perfect sense at that point in time.
Okay. So now my next question is, when I see, for example, you now, there's a whole, an all-rounder kind of a personality, someone who's doing on one side, maybe rap song of your book, then your comedy show, then your TED talk, then skiing. There's a whole all round. Plus, there's an entrepreneur in you who made this company. So now I want you to go behind all of this and give me. So these are, I will call, tree and fruits of life. So now I want you to turn your camera towards the soil and roots. What are the inner thoughts and narratives in your head, and how have they changed over years?
Interesting that you ask this, because I ask the same question to myself at times, saying like I guess all of us introspect what motivates us, what drives us, what makes us do the things that we do.
Hmm.
And besides reflecting on it at times, I spent some serious reflection about 3 or 4 months back when I went on this whole meditation vipassana thing, which has been on my list of things to do for a long time. So for those, I guess you're familiar with it, but for those
Yeah.
who are not, it's about 10 days of silence. So
Hmm.
for someone who's used to checking out his notifications multiple times a day from the moment he wakes up to the moment he sleeps, being deprived of your phone and all sensory input is allows you to get that canvas and time to think about a lot of things, right?
Hmm.
And this was one of the things I was hoping to get some answers to, in a way. I mean, like, what drives it? Is it still a desire to try and prove something to God knows who, or whatever? Is it a genuine curiosity or an interest in things? Spoiler alert, I still don't have all the answers in spite of 10 days of absolute silence. And I guess that's a beautiful thing about these things.
Hmm.
uh, but one thing I did come out with is that a few things, to borrow your analogy of the tree, the soil, the roots. A few things are roots and soil for me, I think, in a strong way. One is making, right? And it can be making anything. It
Hmm.
can be
Hmm.
making a company. It can be making a book. It can be making a piece of paper craft. It can be making just about anything. It can be a virtual thing, like making a podcast or making a talk or making a TED. I see all of those as just different manifestations of making.
Okay. As opposed
And
to consuming, you are saying.
as opposed to consuming, because in the current environment, it's so easy and so much the path of least resistance to be a consumer, right? I mean, you're awash with more movies, series, dramas, YouTube videos, Facebook posts, and noise that than the human body has time for, right?
Hmm.
And it's very easy to sit in that passive, sit back, just let things happen, which is not wrong. I mean, all of us need that and needs to happen at time, but
Hmm.
I think counterbalancing that with some form of making, and each of us
Hmm.
has our own choice in terms of what excites us, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
um I mean, so for example, I think the last time we caught up, you showed me, I don't know if you have that handy, but you showed me that
Yeah.
beautiful piece of work that Ruchi had made. You got to describe it. I know you're doing the interview, but I'm going to interview now. You got to show us what that is.
So this actually, once I read Lux's book NPAT, so there it actually was talking about you make something, and next day Ruchi was going for a workshop which is called copper glass enameling. So
Hey,
this is
bring it closer to the camera if you don't mind, so we can see the copper part and the nice, yeah.
so so this is basically and all these colors are actually glass which were so you design it with copper wires, and then you actually put it in a furnace for 800 degrees and then bring it out, and then actually sprinkle it with different colors and then again put it in the furnace. But the interesting part was when I had read your book, and that time itself and it was talking about just make something for the sake of something rather than always having an end point. And I just said to Ruchi that I'll also come to the class, and it was very well spent 3-4 hours, and I
Was
was
it your first time at the class, or
yeah. This is even for her it was a first time. So it was we both just went to learn. So I thought of you about you and your book a lot of time when I was in that session.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, you're already embracing it. You're making this podcast. You're making a bunch of things. You're making people's lives better. So I don't think you're a stranger to it. I don't think any of us are strangers to it. It's
Right.
just that as we grow and the pressures of work and life and everything start burying that maker, which is very inherent in the
Mm,
child in each and every one of us, those mountains of paperwork and everything tend to bury that, right? So I think it's important to stay in touch with that at all points. And for me, dialing back to your original question, that's a big part of at all times. I have to it becomes a part of my personality now, where I had to keep making something, and that gives me a lot of joy, genuine joy, right?
mm.
The second thing is, I guess, very, very characteristic of any of us as humans, which is we try to make sense of things from a post facto perspective, right? We try
Okay.
to, so for example, everything in religion and all of it is to explain phenomenon so that it makes sense to you, right? I
Mm,
like to think about things from a future perspective, saying what kind of model can I employ that will help me, take a path forward in terms
mm,
of doing something. So
mm,
that's another big part I realized of my life. This is is that I need some kind of mental models,
mm.
right? Maybe it's an MBA hangover. I don't know, because maybe I'm just paying the price for the sins of not having focused on all those business models. But I like having models. So, for example, name place animal thing is at its heart a
Yeah.
model, right?
Yes.
The four words are placeholders for things for stuff. It's a model essentially. And I
Mm,
find that I've been doing that very often in terms of always trying to have some kind of mental models around things, because it helps give structure and
mm,
some sense of sanity to things that you jump onto. Otherwise, it all
mm,
can jump all over the place. So I think mental models and making, I would,
mm.
if you were to ask me to pick and choose, would be those.
Yeah.
And in
In
keeping
fact,
with the mental models, I'm going to call it the 3M model: mental models and making. So 3M there.
so if you actually see the model, what it does, it actually gives you a drone perspective, because when you're drawing a model, you will have the outliers, you will have all the sides by design, because
Mhm.
your system will check whether the, so it actually gives you a maybe a step back drone perspective, and that actually can then allow you to holistically handle things. So that might have
So true.
been so what would you call as maybe if you can describe one or two events which shaped Lux personality, which made Lux who Lux is?
Again, I think there's a lot of events. Meeting and getting married to Tina afterwards on campus, and
Mhm.
besides the fact that it has a huge impact on life, it's because she's been a bouncing board for all my projects, right? So when I write the book, the first version is something I'd give her to read, and in spite of being together for so many years, still wait and see, okay, did you read it? Which chapter are you on? What do you think so far? Okay, don't tell me, no, finish the whole book. And bouncing startup ideas. We've been partners in crime in the previous startup journey and the new one as well. So
Mm.
I would say it's life changing, not just from a point in time perspective, but from it continues to be life changing perspective, and therefore I pick and choose that, not to get brownie points with her, or be all mushy about it, but I think it's had a huge impact in doing things. In fact, the dedication of the book, the first page says, thanks her for never saying only an idiot would do that, because there are a lot of things I've done which only an idiot would have done, and
Mm,
not
mm.
saying that makes a difference, right? So that's one, I guess. And then strangely, I mean, I wouldn't have picked this earlier, but I think getting into ABCL was a second one. And the reason is not because of the job per se, because I had opted out of campus placement that time. And
Okay.
me and two friends had formed an event marketing company called Rope Trick,
Okay.
which was born out of IIM Calcutta in 1995.
Mm, mm, mm.
The first pitch we made was to the Amitabh Bachchan Corporation Limited.
Okay.
And at that time you still have that childhood audaciousness, saying anything is possible, which again is one of those things that often gets killed after a while, where you say, oh, if I write to that person, no way on earth they're going to respond to me, right? But at
Mm,
that point we weren't shackled by any of that. Okay.
mm, mm.
We just heard about this new software which someone, I still remember, a friend of ours from Calcutta, Shanky, you might remember from
I
our
remember.
batch, Shankar Som Banerjee.
Yeah, yeah. Mm.
He introduced us that point to a software called PowerPoint, which was all big. So we date ourselves when we talk about these kind of things.
Mm.
But we made a pitch to the Amitabh Bachchan Corporation Limited because we read about them in the India Today magazine. We didn't have an email address, so we wrote plain old-fashioned letter, put it in an envelope.
Okay.
And in fact, I can't even remember if we did a letter or we did an inland letter, since that was cheaper. It was about 50 paise or 1 rupee cheaper, I think. So one of those. And sent it to the official address that we found of the company. And they replied back saying, we'd love to meet you guys.
Okay.
And instead of giving us business, they finally ended up giving us very interesting jobs, better than the three of us would have ever got on campus, considering our GPAs and aptitude and stuff. And to top it all off, I wasn't a fan. I became a fan over the year. The final letter was given by Amitabh Bachchan. So the audaciousness of going and sending that letter, getting a reply, all of that, and I think there was also a fair amount of luck at that point. But that happening was a big milestone, for the reason that I think that hangover continued through life, saying, unless you try it, nothing's going to happen. So you might as well give it a shot. So I'd still try random things. And some of them do fail. So for the book, for example, I emailed Michelle Obama and asked her if she would like to write a foreword. She didn't. But heck, I mean, if I hadn't asked her, she would definitely not have written. If I asked her, she might have written. So I think that attitude came from that first ABCL thing, and that was important for that reason.
Tell me a little bit about your TED Talk journey, that obituary one. Something about how did that come to you?
That again is I mean, the way, so there are two streams to it, right? One is the content part of it, how the content part of it came about, which actually happened after the logistics part of it. So let me start with the logistics part of it. I think the year was 2016 or something. I was giving a talk at this Twitter conference in Delhi. I think it was called Twitter Udan. I mean, Udan, obviously, for a bird flying and all of that. But Twitter Udan was their conference. And I was running Unmetric at that point. And my general attitude was, if you woke me up from the middle of my sleep, I would pitch Unmetric. Right? So I saw my primary job as the chief, evangelist for the company, which is what any CEO should do, I guess. So once Twitter said you're going to have a whole bunch of brands and agencies in the audience, and you can talk, my natural gravitation was, okay, how do I plug in my company everywhere? And then they said, oh, by the way, you can't plug in your company. Right? And the company is about data and analytics, but we want you to talk about data and analytics, but don't pitch your company, because that is not what this platform is for. Educate, right? Educate, entertain, and those kind of things. Which is actually a tangential good thing into this whole, again, on mental models. One of the other mental models I follow is something that this guy, Manoj Bhargava of 5 Hour Energy said. He said, anything has to be either useful or entertaining. If it's not useful and it's not entertaining, it's useless. Right. So these guys wanted me to give a talk that was useful in terms of data and analytics. They wanted it to be entertaining and not pitch your company. So there's a third constraint to it, right? So I did my best around it, did a data-driven narrative, told stories rooted in data, and it went off decently, I think, because people seemed to like the talk. And there was a guy in the audience who was a curator for this TEDx Gateway, which had just started getting prominence in Bombay. So Yash Raj, who runs that, was in the audience, and as luck would have it, he's flanked by two people, one of whom is an advisor on Metric and another of whom is on Metric's largest client. And he turns and says, do you know that guy? And he says, yeah, I know, we are his customers. Do you know that guy? He says, yeah, I know him, we are an advisor. This is pure luck. Okay? What are the odds and probability of him sitting between the two people I know best in that conference, right? So they both independently introduced me to him. And I guess at that point, there's a certain endorsement saying, okay, if these two guys know him and recommend him, he can't be that much of a joker or whatever. And he says, look, I like your style of talking. I'd love, if you have an idea for a data-driven narrative, we'd love to hear it. So why don't you tell me if you have any thoughts? Again, I went back to my pitchman hat. I sent him half a dozen ideas on how brands have become like people and the new world of brands, and how social will define the world, and how marketing is redefined. And he politely got back to me and said, I think about, if I'm being generous, maybe 5% of my audience might be interested in what you're talking about. And my primary audience, who's a 15-year-old, will definitely not be interested. So none of these topics are interesting. Can you come back with something which a 15-year-old will like and which the other 95% will like? Right? And that's a great segue into, how sometimes you just straitjacket yourself in terms of thinking. I had said I need to think around this, right? But then once you, borrowing your analogy, once you kind of take that drone shot and go a little higher and look at the contours of it, what I was trying to get something around analytics. Now, I was just force fitting the fact that it needed to be around the world of brands. And that sudden moment, aha moment, happened in the morning when I was reading the paper, which, as I've done for the last 15, 20 years, I usually start with reading the obituaries. Because this line that someone told me stuck, which is, if you want to read about man's failures, start from the first page of a newspaper. Want to learn about his successes, start from the obituaries, right? And I truly believe that. So whether it's the Times of India, which doesn't do a great job with the obituaries, or whether it's the Hindu, or whether it's the Telegraph, or whether it's the New York Times, I would read the obituaries pretty diligently. And that's when it went, wow, in my head, I've been drawing dots saying what's common between all these guys I'm reading about. I've been writing notes on my phone on each time I find something fascinating in terms of an obituary or someone who's done something interesting. So I've been trying to draw connective tissue between these, and it might be great fodder for a talk. So that's when I shamelessly borrowed from my colleagues' capabilities at Unmetric, and we pulled out a data stream on the obituaries and said, can you look at these 4 parameters: age, accomplishment, vertical, look at the headline, let's do a word cloud. We just messed around a bit with the data and found some interesting patterns and stuff coming out. And that's when he said, wow, this could be interesting. Let's this could be the talk. So then pitched saying lessons from 2000 obituaries. And he said, you're on, right? Again, crazy coincidence, man, just to complete that story. So I presented in TEDx, what was it? End of 2016 in December was when I presented at TEDx in Bombay. Lady in the audience comes to me afterwards and says, where do you live? And I said, I live in Jersey, in Basking Ridge, close to New York City. And she said, my name is Juliet Blake. I'm the curator for TED. And I'm based in New York City. And you live there. And your talk is from the New York Times. You should be doing this talk in New York City. So I said, absolutely. And then 2 months later, I did that on the TED main stage. And then they put it up on their homepage. And then there was an NPR talk with Guy Raz that happened around it. So that journey took on a life to itself. Of course, it gave me the title of being the obituary guy, which is a bit of a morbid title to carry. But, hey, I'll take it.
Very interesting. So what would you call as a turning point in your life? You have a whole lot of, maybe the graph has a lot of ups and downs, but which one will signify as the key turning point, which changed the way you looked at life?
I think, so 2 points on turning points, right? One is that, again, like a lot of things, they make sense in the rearview mirror. When they actually happen, either they sound so huge that, oh my God, my life's never going to be the same. And then guess what? A year down the line, you look back and say, no, nothing much really changed, right? So now with the benefit of hindsight, I mean, there's an expression, hindsight is 2020. So with that benefit, it might be tempting to cherry pick a few, but I would like to think some of those turning points are still ahead and we still won't recognize them when they happen. But given my penchant for mental models, there's this one model which is also there in the book, which I've shamelessly borrowed from one of my mentors, which is this: think about us juggling 3 balls in the air at any point in time. Right? And you might remember it from having read the book.
I remember.
So just to paraphrase that, at any point you're juggling 3 balls. One is the ball of health, one is that of relationships, and one is that of work, finance. I don't care whether you're doing a startup or you're working for the Fortune 100. It's still finance and work. And we want to make sure none of them fall. The only issue is the one of health is made of glass, and if it falls, it shatters. The one of relationships is made of porcelain. Right? And if it falls, it cracks, which can be fixed with super glue, but the cracks still remain. And the one we obsess about the most, which is the ball of finances, work, and all that, is made of steel, because it falls a few dents and a few bumps here and there, and you're back to normal, right? So borrowing that model, I would say, if I were to prioritize, very difficult to say there's one turning point, but there are turning points in each of these 3 dimensions. So from the last one, the least important first, which is the one of work and finances and all of those things. I think the turning point would have been, founding Unmetric and the failures that started before that, and then founding Unmetric, and then the whole journey and up to the acquisition. that is a turning point, because building a company culture of the kind I wanted and wished was my first job out of college, all those were beautiful, right? So
Mm-hmm.
from that perspective, I would pick that. From the relationships perspective, I told you, I mean, I've been blessed to with a lot of good relationships in terms of friends, family, and all of it. My wife and, I mean, best friend Tina being is probably a big turning point for that, because that allowed me to jump onto a lot of other journeys afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
The health part of it, I think the last 1.5 years has been a turning point from that perspective. For it just been a reminder of how fragile that is. We had a major health scare with our older son when he contracted this very rare autoimmune disease when he was in Berlin, called Guillain-Barré syndrome, that had him paralyzed from the neck down in a span of 24 hours, which
Mm-hmm.
is devastating for anyone, and obviously for a parent. So that was a huge part of our lives for the last year and a half. And just about when, he got discharged from the hospital, we came back, and some sense of not yet normalcy, because we had stair lifts and things installed in the house,
Yeah.
was coming. Suddenly COVID hits,
Mm.
right? And that's another reminder of how fragile we are. Suddenly, 2020 was the year where health was front and center.
Mm.
So I think we've had multiple turning points on that.
So next question is, what would you call as a biggest failure, setback, or rejection that you then turned around in life?
Don't worry, I'm not going to choose this three things model for every single answer. But on the health front, I'm very, very proud of our family in terms of how we navigated all the challenges for the
Yes.
last year and a half. So that's not my accomplishment as much as it's my older sons who unfortunately had to go through all of this and is now back in campus. He just spoke to him yesterday, and he's actually getting back to playing tennis now, and
Wow.
still not, he used to captain the team, not still not moving as much as he would like to, but
Mm.
there, and he's playing and he's moving, and he's actually discovering a different game. So that's been a big journey on the personal front.
Mm.
But just sticking to work, one big setback that I think we successfully totally turned around was the early days of Unmetric. So I was a co-founder of this company called Wembu Technologies, I mentioned, right? So in 2009 or so, I used to lead sales and marketing, and we decided to set up what every other tech company on the planet was doing, which was a Facebook page and a Twitter handle and all of that for Wembu, right? Wembu it continues to be a data backup software solution. Data backups are like root canal treatments in IT.
Mm. Mm.
Everyone needs them, but no one necessarily is excited about them. So obviously, when we set up a Twitter handle and a Facebook page, I was, wondering, what do you say? If you are in the hot, sexy part of IT, there's a lot of things you can say that is interesting, that is cool. But what do you say if you're a data backup utility kind of company? So I found myself hanging around what Symantec and McAfee and Kaspersky Labs and all these firewall security, antivirus, and seemingly boring companies were saying in the utility space, to get a sense of how do they converse with their constituents and their ecosystem, and maybe I can learn lessons from that and borrow that into how we need to converse with our ecosystem, right?
Mm.
So that learning from peers was a big part that drove our social media strategy at that point, and that became an aha moment for maybe there's the need for a product that allows a business to learn from its peers in terms of what they're doing on social. The idea was born within Wembu, and then very soon, my Shaker, who's the CEO of Wembu, and I realized that having a data backup software and a social media company in the same under the same roof wouldn't work. So that's when I moved out and started independently.
Mm.
Side story: he was my first angel investor, and is
Mm.
still one of my best drinking partners to this day. But
Mm.
I digress. So started a product at that point. I just decided that this pain point of knowing what other businesses are doing on social media is probably most pronounced in small hyper local businesses, restaurants, bars, and spas.
Okay.
Why? Because if you have an amazing auditor who did your taxes, I'm willing to bet you're not going to go to Facebook and say, oh my god, my auditor rocks.
Mm.
Whereas if you go to a local restaurant in Bandra, you would go to social media and say, I had a lovely meal over here and I recommend this place. So
Mm.
people are more vocal about certain experiences. And
Mm.
I just cherry picked spas, bars, and restaurants for that, because they're big in the local ecosystem.
Mm.
And we built out a company at that point called Eyes and Feet.
Okay.
So online eyeballs, offline footfalls. Again, in retrospect, very corny name, makes you sound like a serial killer. But
Mm.
eyesandfeet.com was a product which
Mm.
allowed a local business to see. So if you're a, if it was focused on the US market, if you're a local business, you can see who within 10 blocks of you is doing amazing things on Twitter, Facebook, Groupon, Foursquare, and all of that, right?
Mm. Mm.
Build that out, and this is a great lesson, and we won a few awards and all of that, which is great for the ego, but it didn't bring in revenues or anything like that.
Mm. Mm.
And I think we coasted along on those tailwinds for some time, and then the moment of reckoning was when actually splurged the money to fly down from India, which is where I was based at that point, to the
Mm.
States after 1.5 years of building the product, to meet the first restaurant owner that I would, to ask him, what do you think of the product? Right?
Mm.
This was a long but hard lesson on never build a product unless you've spoken to who you're building it for.
Mm. Mm.
Right?
Okay.
I just found over here in the States that restaurant owners didn't have the time of the day. I mean, they were busy running the books, waiting on tables when they are short staffed, buying produce early in the morning. They didn't have time for comparative intelligence and analytics.
Okay.
So we built a kick-ass cool product that most people wouldn't buy. I mean, let alone asking them to pay $10, $20 a month, no way on earth they would do it. So a lot of things that we realized could have been learned earlier if I had just taken the trouble to talk to people beforehand. And that feeling of having spent a year and a half of your life building a product that suddenly you realize is not going to fly is a very hollow feeling in the stomach. Right? But so that was I think a huge setback at that point, because I was pretty down, saying, oh my god, I mean, it's not just me, I've convinced other people saying this is the best thing on earth since sliced bread, and we've all gone along this journey, and it seems to be coming to naught, right? But here's the interesting thing that happened. I pitched it to Citibank in India, and they said, do you have competitive intelligence on other banks? And we said, no, we don't do banks, we do restaurants, bars, and spas, right? Then I came to Washington, D.C., and I pitched it to Capital One, and they said, would you have intelligence on Bank of America and stuff? I said, no, we don't do banks. And I come down to, you can see a pattern here. I come down to New York City, and I go down to Vesey Street, where American Express is based, and I go to their office because they have this thing called Amex Open Forum that talks to small businesses. And I say, we will rebrand Eyes and Feet any way you want. We'll color it in blue in the Amex colors, but just help us get in front of businesses. And they said, look, we can't do all of those things, but do you have competitive intelligence on banks? And that's when finally the tube light in my head went off, saying maybe we should be doing competitive intelligence on big brands and banks and all of that, instead of doing small businesses, right? Maybe we should get banks to pay us thousands of dollars a month or so, instead of getting small businesses to pay us tens of dollars a month.
Okay.
So it was a radical shift, and we went back to the drawing board. Eyes and Feet was a very corny name for an enterprise product. Spent the next 6 months rebuilding the product and rebranded as Unmetric. Our first customer was Citibank, and that really became. I mean, so Unmetric was born out of the phoenix that was Eyes and Feet, so to speak. So that's a journey I'm especially thrilled with, and grateful for all the luck that came with it, because those conversations changed a whole bunch of things.
So what would you call as one of the most difficult conflict or dilemma that you faced, and how did you tackle it?
I was just reflecting on this. Interestingly, I don't think I've ever worked for a company for more than a couple of months that has more than 100 employees. So I don't think this is the best thing to put in my resume, but it's been more of a startup person, right? And one of the reason for that is also because culture has been an important part of work for me, and culture is one thing that's difficult to scale when you get into the large hundreds and the thousands and stuff. It's much easier to keep going at the smaller stages of a startup, right? So what I'm getting at, I guess, is the classic conflict from an organizational perspective is something I fortunately haven't been too exposed to, and I'm grateful for that. But having said that, I think if I extrapolate from that conflict onto personal and professional and a mix of those, that happened after our acquisition.
Okay.
Right. So just to explain the timeline on that, we got acquired in October 2019. I think Tina and I celebrated the week after that. In the first week of November, we're going to Shillong for NH7, the rock festival.
Bacardi.
Bacardi NH7, yes. And that was on the 4th of November. And then, so we were acquired by a company called Falcon out of Copenhagen. 8 months before that, Falcon was acquired by a company called Cision, which is a public company in the US. A week after our acquisition was announced, it was announced that Cision, which was a public company in the US, would be taken private because they were acquired by Platinum Equity, which is a PE group.
Okay.
So long story short, beginning of October, we were these free and wild free agents. By the end of October, by Halloween over here, we had a parent in Falcon, we had a grandparent in Cision, and we had a great grandparent in Platinum Equity. So obviously your corporate world, so to speak, changes, right? So on the 11th of November, I was scheduled to speak in Copenhagen with, announcing the acquisition to Falcon's customers. There was their annual event, and this is again stroke of luck, man. I was in Copenhagen on the 10th for this. I'd flown in. And 10th was when our son was, taken to hospital in Berlin when he was on a school trip there, college trip rather. And I dropped everything and flew to Berlin that night, and life changed for us. And the next 2 weeks was in a military hospital in Berlin, which is an amazing hospital. And then he was airlifted to the States, all of that, right? So that became the focus of our lives at that point, because he had to be airlifted in an ICU, plane equipped with an ICU into the States, and then hospital for a month and a half, almost 2 months over here, discharged. And at the same time, I was navigating this whole transition of our company into the parent, grandparent, great grandparent organization, right? It was difficult to have your heart there fully, because what was happening on the personal front required so much of my time, energy, and which is where I wanted to be, right? So left to myself, honestly, I would have left on that time itself and said, okay, let me focus all my energies at home, which is where it's needed. But I couldn't do that because I had a team who were an amazing team, and I had to shepherd the transition. For a lot of people chose to continue to stay with the acquiring company, and needed to shepherd that, work with them, work with the acquiring company, ensure that my team and colleagues were treated well in the new org. So that took a fair amount of bandwidth. It was exhausting at times, to be honest. And I was constantly conflicted, saying, do I have my priorities mixed up? Should I just drop all this? Because they're all adults, everyone can figure out. But actually waited till the last person transition, which took until the end of April or so, or first week of May. And then in the second week of May is when I put in my papers and left.
Okay.
Right. That was also a big conflict in a way, because the company was a part of my identity for the last 10 years, right? And ironically, you read the book, so the first line of the back cover, and I'm just going to pull that up over here, is basically, so what do you do? This book helps you answer the "so what do you do" question, which we often answer with our jobs. And I just found that when I used to answer that "so what do you do" question before that, I would say I'm the CEO and co-founder of Unmetric, and then a few other things, blah blah blah, right? And then after I left, I couldn't get over it. And people asked me, first I found myself for the first few days, it's almost like that in a new year, when you sign a check, you still put 2020 instead of 2021, right? It's similar to that. I was still saying I'm the CEO. Oops, sorry. I was the CEO and co-founder of Unmetric. And for a few months I was doing that. Of course, I didn't have to do too much of it because the world was in lockdown and you weren't meeting too many strangers anyway. But the few that I did at online events or classes that I did online, I would say I was the CEO. And that's when I just realized how much of a crutch that was, our corporate identities defining our personalities. So that again was a conflict that I think I kind of resolved in a way by writing the book in some ways. Super long answer to your question.
No, that is the intention of this interview. So another question to you is that, I can imagine these 17, 18 months from Copenhagen to now. So I want you to again, go back in your head and narrative on what kept you anchored in all of this journey, because you are not prepared for it. These are the events you can't even imagine will ever happen to you. So what kept you anchored in these times?
It was surreal, right? Because this is something I told you, it's called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which affects 1 in 100,000 people. Where and I just want to explain the medical part of it very briefly, because that explains how surreal it is, right? It's the body essentially attacking its own peripheral motor neurons, which are responsible for locomotion, like your hands and legs, because the body mistakes them to be a variant or a close cousin of a bacteria that had battled earlier. So in our son's case, it was a stomach bug he had the week before, which is not unlike any stomach bug that any of us who've eaten Bhelpuri in Bombay have had. Only thing was, in his case, after he battled that bug, a week later, the body for some reason thought that its peripheral neurons were a variant of that, and therefore attacks it, and that's what renders you paralyzed very, very quickly. This was surreal. When I still remember flying into Berlin and walking into this Bundeswehr Krankenhaus, which is the German military hospital, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, when going to the ICU, navigating my way through a labyrinth of tube-lit corridors with hardly anyone out there.
Knowing English.
No English, met a couple of people and broken English. You kind of figured out your ways to the ICU and, went there and then understood or tried to understand what was happening. I mean, it was devastating, right? So once I'd done my fair share of crying and not able to reconcile what was happening, it just felt like a very, very bad dream, right? After that, it was like, okay, what do we need to do, right? And I think to some extent, stuff maybe you go through in life and as an entrepreneur where you go to jugaad and figure out everything helps in this, because you're like, okay, this has happened, now we need to figure out what to do, right? First thing is, fortunately for us, our son is very, very strong and positive. He's mentally very strong and very, very I can't recall a single day he didn't smile through that entire experience, which was crazy. Right? But that helped hugely. So we were kind of literally feeding off each other's energy in a way.
Okay.
And sitting and saying, okay, what do we do now, right? And first you go through the logistics part of it. So it's just like sitting and saying, okay, let's make a plan for it. And I think that also helps to keep the mind busy and figure out in terms of, okay, we need to figure out transportation from here. We need to figure out what next. We need to figure out care. We need to research this. Obviously, the first port of call is go to Google and research the hell out of everything. Tina was on a flight at that point from Chennai back to the US. She came to know mid-flight on an Emirates flight. And then she landed, had to apply for a visa and come back. My visit visa, Schengen visa, was expiring. So we needed to also attack mundane things like I would be illegal in the country 4 days after that and needed to get that sorted out and stuff like that. So I think there were enough fires to put out that kept us busy.
Okay, but that's my question is you these fires can burn you also. So what allowed you to stay sorted? What were your thoughts or the narratives in your head?
I'm trying to rewind back to that point. I mean, one thing that's been an anchor for me and continues to be even today, it was a different flavor then, it's a different flavor today, is meditation.
Okay.
So at that point, my flavor of meditation was listening to at least 10 minutes of Headspace every day, right? The app. Now it's more of the Vipassana meditation, but I found that was a huge anchor because I would try and do that almost every single day just to, otherwise your brain is just going in so many different directions. So that was, I know a lot of people do it, but that was a huge source of peace for me at that point.
Okay.
I reached out, I also realized at that point that I've been someone who sometimes hesitates to ask for help. Although I have a big friend circle and a good family circle, I don't know if it's ego or a desire not to bother people, but I don't typically reach out and ask for help, although sometimes it's obvious. At this point, I did. Right. And I think there was a mental shift in who I am as a person, and that helped me a lot. So a friend in London who, there's this friend called Anamika and her husband Giorgio, who are Giorgio is German. He said, man, I can come there. I said, I don't need a translator because everyone speaks English here in the hospital. He said, no, it's just good for you to have someone who knows both languages, who's sitting next to you. And I don't have to do a single thing. Can I come there and be with you? My normal thing would be, no, don't bother. And I said, yes, please come. And within a few hours, he was in the hospital. This friend, he flew over and spent 2 days just to stay with us, right? Shan's friends offered to come, and normally I would say, no, from London. They were studying there. And I said, I said, please come. And it was, I think that ability to, reach out to people besides family and talking to them on a regular basis, accepting help from all places where it was offered.
Asking and accepting both.
it takes a, again, I don't know why I was less reluctant before that, or what changed at that point, but that was a big thing. And just knowing that I wasn't alone in this, there were a lot of people besides me and
Mm,
Tina around who
mm,
were, we flew in the ICU and landed in the States, and there were three friends sitting in the airport waiting outside along with our younger son, waiting
mm,
in the airport to help us out from there to the hospital in Jersey, right? Earlier I said, no, the hospital has this covered, we have an ambulance, there's no need, and there was no need, but just having people around just made it so much easier, right? Just
mm,
having that additional scaffolding of strength in people around you.
mm.
And I just
I
found myself
yeah.
being grateful for it, and asking for it and being accepting of it, and I think that was a big thing as well, man.
I think I also feel that probably all this support actually provides some kind of an energy and a space to hold everything together. They may not be physically doing things, but they provide this some other subtle kind of a support. Okay, so
That's a great point, actually, what you're saying, because I now realize when you just said what you did, because maybe that was also the part of the disconnect in my head. When you're asking someone to take a flight and come down, there has to be a very tangible ROI on that,
mm, mm, mm,
right? Which is, it's not a transactional way of looking at it, but it's like, hey, this guy is going to go to the airport, fly down, come. What is the actual tangible thing the guy is going to do? And maybe there's nothing. It was just an accepting of what you said, just the energy of the person being nearby, even if they don't do a
mm,
thing.
mm.
Accepting that, I guess,
Yeah, in
was
fact,
a
this
shift,
German
right?
guy who came to your hospital, the moment he would have come, something would have eased in you.
Totally.
You know that someone who knows the system, who knows the languages around. So I don't. So your level of alert would have eased a little bit. And
Absolutely. And also for the entire family, I think it was a relief to see someone from outside the family who's coming in, cracking jokes. So
mm,
just so not to call him the German guy through, Giorgio
yeah,
Breutz is his
sorry.
name. And I'm a guilty
Yeah,
of not having given,
yeah.
but Giorgio was and is and continues to be an amazing friend. He just came and we hugged each other, and little things, there was a bread place, a bakery near the hospital, where I would just walk past or buy something on a rush and stuff. Next time I went with Giorgio, he sat down and educated me to the beauty of German bread.
Mm, mm,
Okay, and what each one was. Suddenly, you were having those other conversations outside of the hospital, right? Just a reminder that there's a life outside of it. So I think
mm,
all of those things happen. Now, could I have predicted that this guy would come and we'd have a conversation about German bread that would ease some tension in my head? Absolutely not. But it
mm.
happens, right?
Yeah,
Once
yeah.
you give it the room to happen. So great point. I mean,
Mm,
not looking at what is a tangible thing that's going to happen, but just that energy is what we're grateful for. Our son's
mm.
friends, when they came, I mean, there was a youthful energy in that. There's this,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and I guess our son was also relieved at not having his parents hovering around him all the time.
Mm, mm,
Then there's other friend of his, this girl called Carolyn, who came in. Then the other friends of ours, Neela and her friend, they all came. We had a whole bunch of friends around.
mm, mm,
And
mm.
then craziest thing, man, I should mention this also. We were just coming to terms with this whole thing, disease called GBS and all of it. And this German friend Giorgio, he suddenly finds that there's a local GBS support group happening, and he
Wow.
calls up all of them and finds out one of them can actually do it in English that week in
Mm,
Berlin. Okay, what are the odds? And so he tells us, I've spoken to them; they're willing to do it in English for you. And so we land up there, and there's some 8 other people who've got GBS or know somebody who's got it or some variant of it. And it's a support group. They would have typically spoken in German, but because we were the only 2 people who didn't speak German, they spoke in English.
mm,
And to help us translate, there were 2 people, this girl and her boyfriend, and they're both high school students who were roped in by one of their aunts or something because they spoke English. And again, this was total strangers, generosity.
mm.
It was
What?
beautiful. We sat, and then one of them said, "Look, I've been through this in the last 6 months. Would it help you if I came down to the hospital and spoke to you guys
Wow.
and your son?" We just
Mm,
met her, okay? And she comes down to the hospital next day. She cycles down to the hospital and tells our son that I was paralyzed six months ago. I cycled down today, and
mm,
here's a little gift for you. Spends an hour talking with us. And we were just blown away. I mean, again, that's an example. Earlier, she would have said, I'm coming over. I would have said, no, 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 don't bother. It's fine. Thank you so much for your offer. Now I was like, please, can you come? Are you sure? If you can, we would love it.
I think this
So,
is a very useful point, that if you can, we love it.
yeah,
And if you can bring your energy field, I think they bring their energy field, and probably the
absolutely, man.
college friends brought a very different energy field, and a combination of all those energy field is very different than a just a transactional field around, because a lot of probably
Absolutely.
medical team has to do the transaction very well, and then everything else can be thought of. So
Correct.
one question to you is, how has this book changed you as a person?
I think, I mean, first, for some reason, it was an itch I had to scratch, right?
Hmm.
So the journey of writing the book was fascinating. It was like a startup, except it was like a solopreneur kind of an
Hmm.
initiative, right? It's not
Hmm.
a startup with a huge team and all of it, which was probably the perfect prescription for where I was last year with all these things that happened, and after COVID, and leaving Unmetric. I think it is a perfect thing to get onto, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
A lot of the ideas also happened over long walks and hikes, whereas we went to the hospital on therapy. I dropped my son off, I'd go on walks around and ruminate on these ideas, think about it. The first version of the book was something I actually started writing a few years ago as a non-fiction book.
Hmm.
Reread it in the middle of 2020 and said, oh my God, what was I thinking? This is horrible. And then decided to rewrite it in the form of its current avatar, which is a modern fable,
Hmm.
right? Which at that point felt very silly because I've never written nonfiction, I've never written fiction, and I'm trying to attempt a marriage of fiction and nonfiction.
Hmm. Hmm.
So that in itself felt like an interesting challenge. And again, those models I told you about, Manoj Bhargava, who says either useful or entertaining. So I was
Entertaining.
trying to say, can we make it
What?
useful and entertaining and blend both of that, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it ticked off a mental model. So I said, okay, I'm going to do this. Right? Um, so the journey of writing the book in terms of, and I went about it in a very clinical fashion, like I would do with a startup, saying, I need to get to the first prototype format, and then I need to polish it up, and then I need to market it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Okay.
also, instead of trying to figure out each of these, let me figure out who's good with the prototyping. So I found this place called Scribe Book School,
Uh,
signed up with them on how does one write a book?
okay.
What is the discipline required to write a book? And then it's like, how long is the book? 35,000 words. How much do you want to write? About 300 words. And you want to finish it
Per
in
day.
3 months
Hmm.
or so. So roughly you got to attempt 300 words. So I actually had targets, and I would not get up from my chair in the morning unless I wrote at least 300 words on an average
Okay.
every week. So
Hmm.
it was a certain startup discipline that went into it. And then after that, signing up with another place for figuring out how to market a book and this whole Amazon ecosystem and learning the whole world around book marketing
Hmm.
and book production and making it look good and polished and the cover design and all of. So each of those was a journey onto itself.
Hmm.
And as I was going through it, it was just fascinating how many parallels are there with a company and a startup journey as well. It's not very dissimilar. So a few things came out from the book. One was the power of the transmission of an idea when it's in an essay or a book or in the written word.
Okay.
Right. So a lot of the concepts are things you can have in conversations, but when you put them in a narrative format and you put it in a book, and even better, in my opinion, when you weave a story around it, because I think
Hmm.
stories, to
They
borrow a
stick
quote,
better.
that's it's they stick a lot better in the head, right?
Hmm.
You're wired for remembering stories.
Yeah.
And to borrow a quote from the book, stories are the best way of having and passing along empathy, right?
Hmm.
So that way, that was a it's something you always know as a business, but just reinforced in me the whole power of storytelling as a vehicle for anything that you do,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So right now, if it's something new, it's like, okay, what's the story? How do you, even if it's
Hmm.
the new company that we're doing, I'm starting off with the story and the narrative rather than starting off with the product. So it's changed how I think about things from that perspective,
Ah, yeah, yeah, yes.
right? The
What's
power to impact absolute strangers is huge.
hmm, hmm, hmm.
I have people I've never met who've writing reviews in the book, who signed up for my email newsletter, and that's, I won't lie, it feels nice. It feels wonderful when someone writes in and says, "Oh, I love the book," right?
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
And someone, more importantly, someone says, "I'm starting to do a puppeteer thing that's been in my head for years, but I haven't touched it, and your book was a catalyst for me to embark on that."
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Last week, that same friend, the German friend, Giorgio,
Giorgio.
they read. So Giorgio and his wife sent a photo after reading the book saying, "We are traveling near and narrow," which is one of the
I remember.
concepts in the book, saying, "Don't travel far and wide, travel near and narrow." I won't give away anything more in the book, but Place talks about that. So having people share experiences, share how it's transforming, how again, how it's a model that they can apply in life has been the most gratifying thing. I'm the parallels between that and company building and all of that has been fantastic as well, because now there are, just like I took lessons from the company into the book, now the reverse is happening and taking lessons from the book into the new company that we're doing. So it's just fascinating how these things kind of cross pollinate each other, right?
Okay. So I think you follow now many. Let me still ask you this question. What is the most unusual and absurd activity or hobby that you regularly do now? Because there might be many, but you could pick one out of all of them.
There are many, fortunately, and I keep dabbling in a whole bunch of random things. I sample a lot, I should say. I'm not and one of them that I sampled in November or December and stuck on to, and interestingly, I actually have a session this evening at 8 o'clock Eastern time. So roughly it's exactly what I'm going to be doing 12 hours from now.
Okay.
Is there's this group called Freestyle NYC, which is a freestyle hip hop group.
Okay.
So it's freestyle rap. Right. So the founder of the group is this guy called David B.S. Bradshaw, and his website is Trust BS, like trust bullshit. So trustbs.com, and he is a freestyle rapper.
Okay.
And he's found this tribe. It actually started off as a splinter group of Hamilton and Lil Manuel Miranda, which had this freestyle Love Supreme kind of group that I signed up for a weekend class. Then met this other. I've always been fascinated by freestyle rapping. It's something I used to do after having one too many drinks in college. But and then you buried it down there, and then suddenly you find there's this tribe of middle-aged men and women who trip on it, right? And some people are not so middle-aged and young. And Zoom and being online is the perfect vehicle for it, because these are people who are dotted across in different places. So I was fortunate to stumble upon this group, and every Wednesday from about 8 to 9:30, we just riff, right? So for example, today's homework, you have one prepared section, we have one impromptu section.
Okay.
Today's prepared section is I've got to do that homework after this call, is I've got to write a 16-bar rap song on my horoscope for this week.
Okay.
So this is good because it just takes you into a totally random tangential mind space, right? In terms of doing random stuff which has no real value in terms of work or life, but it just forces your creative juices. And then after that, you're tripping with a bunch of people, you're playing a beat, and then you're with the same mic over here rapping and going this way and stuff. And you can afford to look like, if I do that right now, I look like a fool. But if I do that in that group, it's fine, because everyone is doing exactly that. There are 6 people who are doing freestyle rapping. You stumble and they egg you on. And then after an hour and a half, you're like energized and pumped after having rapped and rhymed for an hour and a half. So I think that's the craziest thing I'm doing these days.
Very, very interesting. So I think 2 last questions is, what advice would you give to a smart driven leader is the first question. And the second one is, what advice would you give to a budding author who still is carrying a book in his or her head and not delivering it? So 2 questions last for you.
So the first one, in terms of more generalist advice, and this again, I'm liberally borrowing from the book, because
in fact,
none of the things I've kind of
has a lot of connections.
It has a lot of connection, and it's been a vessel for a lot of thoughts that I hold deeply to be true, right? So we keep tossing a whole bunch of values and thoughts and value systems and what are the ideals and things that anyone should have. But I'm pretty convinced that these 3 that have been discussed to some extent in the book are the strongest ones and the most important ones, right? Curiosity, humility, and empathy. And it's very easy, and empathy has become a fashionable word. It's become fashionable to say I'm an empath or whatever that means. But I think it's important to have a very tangible way of approaching these as well, because it's not easy. For some people, it doesn't come naturally, but there are ways to catalyze it. And it starts with curiosity. because the more you try to find out, and the more you try to do and stumble on, and for example, that rap thing I just told you about, the more I stumble on it and find someone who is so adept at on his feet thinking up a 16 bar song that rhymes, and he sings it to tune, and he moves his body, and it's stuff I could never ever dream of doing. That should in your head at least trigger a bit of humility, saying here's some saying here's something I could never do or will struggle to do, and this guy just comes so naturally, right? So I think the more things you're curious about, the more worlds you occupy, the more things you try to do, and the more you see how little we know and how much some people are good at things, it just triggers more and more humility, right? And a combination of these two, I would argue, also catalyzes empathy, because when you occupy those different worlds, your ability to step into somebody else's shoes, truly feel what somebody else is feeling without pretending or saying it because it's a cool thing, it actually improves. You strengthen that empathy muscle, so to speak. So I think there's an interconnectedness between these three, and I would argue that for any individual leader, executive, they're probably the three most important traits. You can apply that lens on activities, you can apply it on places, you can apply it on things, you can apply it on life, on work, on whatever, but it applies. And it's currently Biden's speechwriter, who wrote his acceptance speech, John Meacham. He's written a lot of interesting books, and he's like a presidential historian, and he's also observed this. So that's kind of borrowed from some of his writing, where he said the three traits that are the hallmarks of any great president, not to get political, but we've not seen too much of it in recent times, are these three: curiosity, humility, and empathy. And he talks about some of the best presidents in American history, and even in world history, having exhibited these three traits. So long story short, I think these are three I would say one needs to actively cultivate and have a plan towards cultivating. Right. On the second part, which was advice to a budding author, I think it's I would expand that to a budding creationist of any form.
Okay.
Whether it's creating a podcast like you did and are doing, whether it's creating a book, whether it's writing an online essay of 1,000 or 1,500 pages, whether it's creating a small piece of art like Ruchi did and you joined her for, and all of these things, very often we tend to be our worst critics, right? Suddenly say, okay, this, if Ruchi started off doing that, saying this needs to hang in the Museum of Modern Art, there's no way should I ever started, right? If I started off saying this book needs to be a New York Times bestseller, there's no way I would have ever started.
Okay.
So I think to some extent it is a very conscious way of quelling this inner critic that all of us unfortunately have. And then again, it's a question of learning process, because each of these things has a certain process. So with the book, for example, I split it up into three parts. Writing the book, the production part of the book, and marketing the book. And then I said, okay, who beats how? Rather than going to Google and figuring out everything around a writer mentality, let me talk to people who've done that. And then I learned from them that the process is, the first thing you do is, it's a very simple process, but it makes sense in retrospect. You write what is called a vomit draft.
Okay.
So the vomit draft is, are you familiar with the term, the vomit draft?
I can understand what it means literally. But
that's the beauty of terms like that, if it's intuitive, right? You literally vomit it out. But there are rules, okay? When I wrote the first draft of the book, the rule was you had to visualize the backspace key as hot lava almost.
You
can never touch backspace. Right? So one of my fellow authors in the group
you can't take back. You have to keep
putting. Oh my God, the grammar was wrong. Oh my God, that character needs to be killed. Too bad. The character is alive. Continue.
Very interesting.
Because the moment you go back and start, then you're saying, oh my, what was I thinking? This looks stupid. It's exactly what happened to me when I read the first version of the book and I said, oh my God, what was I thinking? So to prevent exactly that, which is unfortunately, the natural thing that happens, till I wrote the first draft of the book, I did not edit anything. And once you get a vomit draft out there, a few things happen. One is you put in that Herculean effort of getting a whole bunch of words out there. Right? And you say, okay, it must amount to something. And then there's a process after that also. Don't start editing right away.
Okay.
Don't look at it for at least a week. Ideally for at least a month. I don't look at it for 2 weeks.
Okay.
Draw the distance between you and your work. So specifically, since you asked about writing, I mean, that's really the steps. Write out a vomit draft, keep the distance from it, and then get into editing. I use this place called Scribe Media School, who used to run their schools out of Austin and charge more than about $15,000 for someone to attend. And then, like everybody, the pandemic happened and they had to reinvent their business. So they did something very counterintuitive. All these lessons that they used to impart on person, they took all of it and put it online and give it for free.
Oh, okay.
Okay, everything's free. So if you go to Scribe Media, Scribe Book School, everything is free online, and amazing content on everything I told you in much more detail and much more better explained is out there on how to write a book and how to quell this inner critic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then if you want a bit of help, like I did, where you want additional pair of eyes on your outline and someone to help you with maybe cover design or formatting and proofreading and marketing and all of that, they have services that you can sign on for. So the free content became a lead generation, and I think it expanded their business beyond anything that had happened before that. It's fantastic, man.
Wow.
It was change that was forced on them, but kind of became transformative, and I was the fortunate beneficiary of that.
Good, great. I think this. I just love the style, and I think I always remember you as a creative, funny guy. Though we didn't interact that much in the campus, but whatever your journey I have traced, and especially after I have read the book, and it's been I think a total joy interacting with you here in this session, and I think the that think different, not just from the work side, but think from different way, come with a different approach. So I really wish that you continue this, as well as this style spills over whoever meets you or whoever.
Thank you, man.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I mean, first of all, for saying what are your words? Creative, funny guy, and not saying interesting joker. So that's a good choice of words. I'm so glad we got in touch again after so many years. I've been in touch with you, I feel, through your newsletter, which I've been reading for some years now. I think you've gone through your own very interesting, fascinating journey, and looking forward to talking to you more about that now that we're in touch again.
Yeah.
But thank you for having me on this, for being the conversationalist that you are, teasing out all of these stories and weaving it into a narrative. I thoroughly enjoyed this, man. Thank you.
Thank you.